This is a Viva PR podcast.
And one of the things I'm observing when I'm in an organisation is how does the chief exec treat the directors of comms? They want you to lean into the heroes, give us some heroes. Is there a hero security guard? How do you say difficult things? Their perception now is that truth and trust is in a really perilous position. I mean, I trained with responders who were still using the PowerPoint slides that said things like feed the beast at 12, 6 and 10.
Welcome to PR in the Real World. I'm Tony Garner, and today we've got an absolutely belting episode. We've got Dr. Lucy Easthope, who advises governments, emergency services and major organisations through some of the most devastating events imaginable, from 9/11, tsunamis and the Manchester Arena attack. Lucy is widely regarded as the UK's leading voice in disaster recovery and crisis response. And if you've read her best-selling book, When the Dust Settles, or heard her on Desert Island Discs, you'll know exactly why she's so influential. In this episode, we're going to explore how language can heal or harm and why comms teams must take a helicopter view. Plus, we'll look at the dangers of Hopium and the future of crisis comms in a world that never switches off. This is an absolutely really insightful conversation with someone who really knows their stuff. She's trusted at the highest levels nationally and internationally. Here's Dr. Lucy Easthope.
Hello, Lucy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're not going to do the classic what shaped your thinking intro bit. Anyone who wants to know that should listen to the Desert Island Disc with the lovely Lauren Laverne, or read your brilliant book, When the Dust Settles, which I did probably a year or so ago now, and which moved me, shocked me, saddened me in turns. It was a brilliant read. Recommend that to anyone. You've spent your career helping governments, responders and organisations navigate some really difficult, unimaginable times: 9/11, 7/7 bombings, the Manchester Arena attack. And in our setup call the other day, you mentioned being inspired as a young person, particularly by the Hillsborough disaster playing out and how the victims and their families were spoken about and portrayed. What was happening at that time in your life, and how did that spark your interest and push you into this field?
And I was a very proud, activated child, I think. I was a child of Merseyside. So this idea that it was my people was very, very strong to me. So I was born in Wavertree in Liverpool, and we moved to Birkenhead, and we would travel back to Wavertree every weekend for lunch with Gran, and all of the family were Liverpool based. And this, well before the disaster, I'd become quite interested in news and buying the Liverpool Echo and newspapers. And all of a sudden, this was my people being talked about. And one of the things about looking at disasters through a 2025 lens is you forget the language used in the 90s about disaster. And, the word scum was used in relation to Hillsborough. Incredibly offensive and degrading allegations were made about Liverpool people and any fans on that day. And my path then, I became just incredibly interested and distressed by the idea that both these terrible events could happen, but also how people were treated after them. And as an adult, I would look back and think, did I really feel that? And then obviously in my course of my career as an adult, I've become very aware of children of other disasters, of Amatrice, of New Zealand, of Turkey and Portugal, and then of Grenfell in 2017. And those children at 8 or 9 are just as activated as I was, and are just as proud of their people and just as offended by the language used by responders. And so I think that shaped me. I think I sometimes feel words very, very much like barbs, and you'll know from my social media, sometimes people will put things out. The current government, but it seems to be particularly struggling, and it's borrowing language, or it's borrowing terms and words in communication, sounding bloody obvious, but words really matter. and that stayed with me.
Our audience is particularly made up of PR and comms professionals, and many of these have a role to play in crisis situations. I'd like to discuss today with your views and philosophy on communication. And I mean, you've already talked about language and how important it is and finding the right word, but how did your views on that get formed?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. In fact, nobody's ever asked me that. And it gives me a chance to wax lyrical about studying English language, not English lit. I love my lit, but it's not English lit. It's English language. It's very different. At A level at the wonderful Birkenhead Sixth Form College, and a big shout out to them. And what I learned there was the power of words, which again sounds really, really obvious, but you did quite a lot of coursework for that A level, and one of my projects was on the use of language in the courtroom and how the barrister uses Latin to make the pleb and the proletariat feel stupid. And so I became very fascinated with how language hurts, which of course as a girl growing up in a girls' school in the 80s, like you already knew how language hurt. And I was reminded, actually, I was at an event the other night with Luke Wright, the performance poet who I adore. And he was talking about the origin of the word Benny, which was the main insult when I was at primary school, that you were a Benny. And I just hated it. I was always a Benny. And then he explained that Benny was the origin was Benny in Crossroads. So it meant somebody a bit daft. And I was like, wow, that was my main insult in my 80s and 90s. And when you go to his shows, he explains the origin of like great insults and slang. And I think that was such a start for me in how words hurt and how words get made and how words get claimed. And so that has really stayed with me. And in fact, one thing, if listeners are liking this, I really wax lyrical on this with the poet Michael Rosen in a podcast called Word of Mouth, where he had me on to talk about disaster dialogue.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things for me was just how clever PR can be, what a power it is, and how cruel it can be. And I think, so I'd gone much later on, my master's degree, and then I did my PhD in medicine, and my PhD is in what we call very intimate ethnography. So actually a lot of that's non-verbal. Intimate ethnography is watching, for example, one of the great studies is watching a neonatal nurse apply a tube to a neonatal baby in the intensive care. And the study teaches us, the tiniest actions, and very little is said. So sometimes in disaster, a lot is about not words. It might be signs, or it might be how a head of comms has made somebody feel. So one of the big controversies at the moment is a lot of families in the maternity scandals have asked very early on in their terrible experience to meet with the team that treated them. And the letter's been beautifully worded and crafted by years of health comms, but it invites the parents back to the ward to meet the people where the damage and the harm was done. So sometimes for me, comms is not just about the words, it's also about the kind of the whole concept, the feeling, the creation. And that, I think, the big one that people have really seized on from Desert Island Discs is a story that isn't mine. It's been told to us in folklore, in disaster management, which is replicated in the documentary drama Hillsborough by Jimmy McGovern, which is that the tea urns at the gymnasium where families of the Hillsborough disaster were waiting for terrible news, the tea urns had signs on them for police only. And so one of the things I really urge colleagues working in communications to do is look at the whole, look at it in a macro, get in the helicopter and look above. You can do lovely words, but your actions. I mean, one of the things I talk about in my PhD is public meetings for flood survivors held at primary schools. A, that changes how you perceive the primary school. It's supposed to be a safe nest of a space. But B, the survivors would be made to sit in those little chairs. Only one buttock would fit. And I think one of the things, and I'm very conscious of how, because of course there's communications, which is the people who train specifically in this, and then often there's training for senior managers and leaders in communications. And I remember being at one of those meetings, and I always often quite feel sorry for the people in this position, but it was a very senior lady at the Environment Agency, and she'd been asked to come and talk about why their area had flooded. And they asked some questions, and her first reply was, "I don't know your area at all."
Oh.
Your reaction says it all, and I think those are the sorts of things where she's being honest. You would say that was definitely her being candid.
Yeah.
But that, I remember the noise in the room. You made a similar noise, noise in a public meeting. And one of the things, I'm jumping all over, but one of the things that's so difficult to do is a public meeting in tragedy. Like, surely that's one of the greatest tests of our ability to find words. So for me, words are everything, but also no words are everything too.
I like that idea of that, taking that helicopter view, because as comms professionals, like you said, we do spend a lot of time crafting the words and trying to look at it from every which way, but then that wider story of understanding where this is going to be used and how it's going to be communicated and who by and whatever is sometimes kind of forgotten when you're looking at where the comma should be going.
And the public never see the work of good communications. For for two, I'm working on about 8 incidents at the moment, and for 2 recent incidents, the statement that went out to the press, it wasn't in the earlier stages, so there was a bit more time to craft it. And it had to be right. I don't know what right means, but it had to be right, and I was part of that. And it went back and forth for care and sensitivity and appropriateness and did that sound wrong, in both cases, different ends of the country, for 8 weeks.
Wow.
And it was probably, the final product was probably 400 words.
Yeah.
And I don't think the public get to see that. And that interests me again with things like candor and version control. One of the things that I'm encouraging senior leaders and responders to do more and more is practice what I call practice your lyricism. And you can imagine they go, what now? But what I mean by that is practice with me how you're going to write difficult, how you are going to write the words that convey really difficult things, and all the way through the instance. So sometimes, for example, that people spend a lot of time crafting initial press briefings. That's something we constantly test and exercise. But how do you brief internally a minister? What words are you using? Because really, for me, there should never be 2 faces, so that the things need to be the same.
Yeah.
But with different audiences, but you shouldn't tell one more than the other. That's a Hillsborough error as well, that you're showing your true, dark, unnecessary, wrong lies, one for here, but then you're saying something else over here. Just, if you've got a concern, find a way to express it with both faces. And then I think the other thing would be the lyricism of the longer press release at the 3-month point. The challenge of explaining difficult things. One of the things that I think the pandemic has thrown up in the air for comms and PR is we had some really well-used, well-trodden tropes, didn't we? Throw the scientists out at 5 o'clock, put slides behind them. I remember the years of being told the public will trust scientists and fire personnel. And now, are either of those things true? I mean, I trained with responders who were still using the PowerPoint slides that said things like feed the beast at 12, 6 and 10. And one of the things about sort of crisis response is when we went to 24-hour news. And I remember being in New Zealand, they may have 24-hour news now, I haven't checked, but they certainly didn't, a few years ago. And they were like, you guys are really screwed with 24-hour news, because it was like, feed the beast, 12, 6, 10. And then that went, and you were like, oh no, the beast is hungry all the time. And even the concept of the idea of the media, which brings us so much truth and social justice. You'll see me condemn certain aspects of the media, but as a concept, some of my greatest, the greatest social justice has been achieved by independent investigative journalists. So I hate comms training that denigrates the media.
You said at the start that back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, there was often language used around disasters was defensive, weaponized, and sometimes just outright brutal. How has that changed, do you think? Are we that much better now in the 2020s, or you know, other areas where we've gone backwards or become too defensive again?
Yeah, and we're still capable of terrible harms, aren't we? And we're still doing really bonkers things. I mean, this week's current ire is that use of the faux apology that people have been putting out. You know, that most recently we've seen one from the Department of Education that's like an apology to everybody. And you're like, you do need to apologize. Like the nation's children are staring in while you're doing fake apologies. And it began as a sort of brand trope, didn't it? Like, oh, we must apologize for unmitigated joy that comes from this product. An apology shouldn't be treated like that. And one of the things I'm always fascinated by is like brand and marketing meetings where some of those things that are so bad are signed off. And it does interest me, you know, and colleagues and I will try and really highlight both good examples and bad examples of communications. I think we're in a very interesting place. We're in a place that hasn't worked out what candor is, which is going to become very relevant with the public accountability legislation. We're in a place that still battles with how to tell the truth. We're in a place where we're still telling things like the good lie, which is telling people what they want to hear. One of the things that really interests me when I do chat to journalist colleagues is their perception now is that truth and trust is in a really perilous position. And I think, you know, that's the kind of things that we're starting to see from things like poll data. So I'm really interested in where communications go as trust continues to be eroded. It's still incredibly hard to get honesty after a disaster or a tragedy. And I think one of the reasons for that is it's very complicated sometimes with things like contempt of court, that legal positions around what information can be released, and also a sort of what I call the doubting Thomas phenomenon, which is that the public and the community affected will have a very clear idea of what's happened, but the civil servants will need a lot more proof, or the sort of official account will need a lot more proof. So you end up with a position where the media and the public are probably closer to a position. And I think, of course, we're in the age of what we're calling mis, dis, mal, and gas. So misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and gaslighting. And even I think I've only been caught out twice with images of on social media. And one was the last Pope in a puffer jacket, and I was desperately hoping that was true. I feel that all of a sudden I had quite a lot of ex-followers. You know, I went from an account with 200 and I could just, you know, post it with abandon, to having an account of 31,000 followers at one point. I think I'm about 30 now. And somebody one day said, you know, almost as a chastisement, you're a big account. And I thought, am I? And I suddenly thought, wow, that, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So I'm very careful, because I was doing that thing of, you know, retweets aren't endorsements. So I was sharing interesting stuff in the early days for the point of discussion. And now I'm like, oh gosh, I've got to be really careful and curate really carefully. And so, yeah, I'm really interested as to where communications will go, and the role of AI and all of that kind of thing.
You've been clear in the past that one of your biggest criticisms of crisis response often comes down to the idea of this, how did you make me feel? What do you mean by that, and where did that mindset come from?
Yeah, and I think that's really, really important in the new writing. So in the new book, Come What May, it's the answers to a lot of questions when I put out a memoir, and people are interested in both the memoir, but also things like, how has it changed your worldview? How do you cope with some of this information? And, you know, there's concepts for me like dignity and more and more in my recent work I've got involved in maternity and patient safety campaigning. And even when people are doing good, sometimes the words will clash and clang. So there's a big move to sort of, lots of maternity world uses mum. So come on, mums. And so there was this discussion of in safety issues and in criticality issues, we don't, is mum the right word? So I think sometimes you'll see me raise concerns that even when things are coming from a good place, how they may land. And one of the things that I think applies to both of our worlds, emergency response and communications and PR, is a failure of imagination and not being able to see how something might land or be experienced by other people. A golden mantra in the 80s and 90s disaster world was definitely, how is this, how would this feel to you? How would you feel to experience that? And that comes down, as I say, to issues like dignity and care. More and more now, though, I think there's a slight challenge to that as a mantra, which is to be really careful that just because you don't think that would land badly, you still need to look at it from a sort of evidence base. So one area I get a lot of heat on social media is my work around what we call bad help, which is things like the donating of secondhand goods. And that's where the comms can be lovely, and that's where that's the ultimate test of communications, because you're offending a group of people doing lovely things. So it's churches and primary schools and mosques, and you're saying, actually, what would be really helpful is if you sold the items yourselves and donated the money to the designated trust appeal. And I have to say that that's the area I get most hate
really?
on my social media. So I think the other thing about one of the things that we're losing in the world at the moment is an ability to maybe course correct or provide an evidence base. People, it doesn't matter how many times we share articles on why it's not helpful, but right now, as we go into Christmas and winter, a lot of people are tagging me in saying there are some exceptions, but generally cash donations are better to organise charities, whether that's animal sanctuaries or homeless help or anything like that. And it will still come back as a really kind of negative wave of anger. So I think one of the things for me is constantly learning. That's really important. When you hire my advice or me as a consultant, you very rarely get a kind of fixed position. And I'm constantly being challenged or schooled by a new incident. One of the accusations which we have to explore, and I think was right to have the discussion, was the idea of donating money, a very racist position, because it didn't understand how certain cultures wanted to give. So, and that was a really helpful discussion that, again, I find social media very, very useful for. But certainly think about how you would want to be treated if you raise a concern. So one of my big flags is defensive language from the health sector, particularly. Yeah. And in my own case, I wouldn't call it a complaint. I submitted a letter to the health trust that had delivered my first live daughter. And I say that deliberately because one of the things I talk about in When the Dust Settles is pregnancy loss. And I wrote a letter about my experiences in under the care of the obstetric team. And the hospital wrote back and said, we have looked into this and find there is zero likelihood of this event happening.
Right.
Wow. And of course, one of the things that my first degree was in law. I grew up in the 90s with a very different world, actually, in terms of the understanding of what we call tort law, TORT law, and civil litigation. And that brutality of the legal place and that the courts. And I always remember being, as a law student, so grateful for that A-level in English language where I studied the courtroom, because God, it's brutal. Yeah. And I just think one of the things that we're actually doing wrong at the moment is we're not actually preparing family survivors, bereaved, the community for the legal space. I mean, the legal space hasn't really evolved at all. And so one of the things you can do is you can be lovely in your comms for quite a long time into the incident. And then when the law kicks in, wow, It's really brutal.
How do you mean? Just let's unpick that a little bit more.
Yeah, so just that, the process wants that you can have, a victim-centered communications, and you can have victim support provided, but ultimately the courtroom is quite an alien space. It's, I don't think I'd describe many courts, even the coronial process, as, say, trauma-informed. So these are quite difficult spaces. So all of a sudden, the process will be what the process has to be.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the debates last weekend was that hospitals and others weren't providing support for fathers in traumatic births. But actually, the law has been very clear under a particularly brutal aspect of civil law called nervous shock, that fathers aren't entitled to care. And of course, the legal system and the insurance systems are often where a company or an organization will decide how to look after people is what its legal obligation is. And in fact, one example, if you're working because I mean, let's be honest, directors of areas like communications often have quite significant power with their chief exec. So one thing I'm building more and more into what we call kind of gold exercises, so exercises with senior management, is to test the difficult. Maybe your legal position is that you don't have to provide this care, but maybe your moral and your PR and your reputational angle would be that you are going to be a little bit more thoughtful and trauma informed. So those are the sorts of injects you'll see you'll see me putting into exercises for golds.
So going back to the letter you got from the hospital trust, are you thinking that was potentially the legal team of kind of informed the thinking of the comms thing, so that you get quite a formal dismissal because we're clearly in the clear here, so go away.
Hard, defensive, let's get this off the table.
In incidents that you brought into, how closely do you work with the comms professionals and in other areas as well?
Absolutely, side by side, more and more. It's a profession that, as you well know, I don't know what the final statistics are, although I think there's some research. There are amazing women working in it. There's a lot of allegiance, I think, between women colleagues in this area. Often colleagues have gone into comms and PR from journalistic backgrounds, so they're very savvy to the issues. So it's not just that our subjects align, it's that our heads and our mindsets align.
Yeah.
And one of the things with that intimate ethnography head on, one of the things I'm observing when I'm in an organization is, how does the chief exec treat the directors of comms? And sometimes they'll have brought in external consultancy, they'll be taking advice on a specific project. But if it's an organization with a communications team, I'm always very interested. And actually, a couple of years ago in an incident, I did quite strongly say to some senior leadership, I was a bit stunned as to how much they were sidelining their communications, because it's everything to me. And it's not what I think I'm really proud of. And I think, my wonderful colleague Amanda Coleman's really advanced this in the field with things like her book on reputation, which is really important, is it's not brand management. It's about telling the truth. It's about getting information out. So of course there are allies, and that's really important. The other thing that we see happening in extremis, in disaster situations, is that senior management think they're all comms professionals. And they all, what really interests me sometimes in situations is where the whole gold team will want to sign off a statement going out. And I'm just wow, respect the expertise. And be like, oh, we're gonna do some open heart surgery over here. Know who you've either seeking advice from, or you've retained, or you've employed. And so for me, it is an art form. And one thing I do think that I've done some work towards, and I hope to continue this, is that the world doesn't see it as kind of washing of a reputation, No. And so actually for me, any absence of a communications person when I'm in an initial response is a real concern.
And does that happen often, or these days is comms usually at the top table and listened to?
No, I'm still finding organizations where it's middle, sort of, or invited in at the wrong times, or certainly this idea that senior management are just as good at posting.
Yeah.
If your comms lead, and you obviously tell me if you disagree, if your comms leaders don't do this, like, that has to be listened to. And I still go into responses where that's routinely overruled. I'm working on other ones where I think the communications has been mind-blowingly brilliant.
Right.
And one of the difficulties when you see amazing, beautiful, trauma-informed, person-centered, community-centered communications is it's very hard to celebrate that,
Yeah.
because you're not going to put it forward for an award. It could be communications about some of the most sensitive things in the human experience, and all that really comes from that is that I know that it was beautifully done and compassionately done, and I try and tell the person or the people or the team. And that's what I would say when you're working in communications and PR in extremis. You don't tend to get the medals in the same way, but know that people like me see it. That would be a really important message for me.
Going home at night knowing you've done a good job and knowing you've made a difference.
That's the very best you can hope for sometimes working in this field. And sometimes what's really strange, and not to denigrate award ceremonies at all, but you'll see awards and the thing's been great, but it tends to be for quite safe things or campaigns.
Yeah.
The most incredible use of words, and knowing when to be silent, knowing when to step back, and knowing perhaps, one of the things that's been really amazing with a lot of the teams that I've worked with since both books have been out is that the comms and PR colleagues have really embraced the concept of the recovery graph, which I talk about a lot. And this is the idea of there's the incident, and then there's this brief honeymoon phase that central government and others love, and they'll want you to ramp up the love stories of the place. They'll want you to lean into the heroes. Give us some heroes. Is there a hero security guard? It lasts about 8 weeks.
Right.
If you fall for its siren call, you then basically set yourself up for a much harder, but what will be inevitable slump. We always see a slump. And at that point, you're going to get what we're starting to call in disaster comms. That there's the long read and the panorama investigation and all those other things that make you look really, really short-sighted with your early approach. And I'm finding that the disaster recovery graph works particularly well with PR and communications colleagues. And I'm really grateful to my publishers there, because they put out some nice graphs and assets that you can, that are sort of visual, and people are using them in their training. Again, it's not about gaming this. It's about understanding that you can do harm. And one of the big harms that people don't always realize is actually calling somebody a hero, a miracle, a one-off, unique, can be really difficult in their own survivor experience. So one of the things we try and train journalists to do is to stay away from heroism tropes.
Yeah.
With the one guy that survived the Air India crash, there was an awful lot of this guy's a walking miracle, and that's incredibly damaging and dangerous. One of the horrible things about the sort of social media story arc is the more people you kind of feed the beast with, the more they get chewed up and spat out later on. So I find that my PR and comms colleagues are the most receptive to some of these concepts, and it makes sense to them.
That's a really important lesson, and we'll put the graphs in the show notes so that our colleagues can share them. But this idea that we get drawn to a disaster, an attack, in that immediate 24-hour news cycle and pour over that. But for the people who live through that it's a lifetime, isn't it?
And we go back to that earlier point about the words matter and how you make people feel. People become sort of almost terrible nicknames. So so I'm thinking about, and we've actually had suicides where people have become labeled as much as labeled villains, the heroes have found that very difficult. But also, we see that people are never allowed to sort of rest or put the story to bed. They can be a lot of disaster families, and indeed for families of things like murders and terrible crimes, have said to me, they'll be eating their tea 15 years on, and the photos are used to illustrate a completely different point. You're never away from it. And I do think that the kind of ethics of how we tell the stories of disaster, really, you want to start thinking about them from the minute it's happened. And again, that's where I've seen amazing advice, often to their own detriment. Directors of comms have said, I don't want to run this story. And you can see that they're disappointing their colleagues who are like, this would be the great story to tell. What's wrong with you? And so they have to have a fight. And then 8 years, 8 weeks or 8 years, but usually 8 weeks later, their bosses or colleagues will say, phew, you got that one right. The fact that they've given them hell for 7 weeks. And it's things like, there's been a couple, both here and many examples internationally, there'll be terrible loss of life. And then somebody will want to run a story, like the fish tank survived, and they'll want to make the story of all about, Arthur the goldfish. And the director of comms is like, it's just not the right time. Yeah. And the exec will be like, what's wrong with you? Arthur the goldfish is a great story. And so the comms person then takes a battering for about 7 weeks and then is right. So it's a really lonely place sometimes, extremist comms, I would say.
When we were discussing the episode last week, you were saying that today we tell fewer bad lies, but we still tell quite a few good lies, like over optimistic timelines. Have you got any other kind of examples of what good lies are?
I think we really struggle with how to deliver bad news to communities, and this will become one of the things. You can look out your window and think, well, it's relatively sunny today, and also I'm kind of focused on the here and now. But one of the things about perhaps being a young comms and PR professional is that you are going to see one of the things I always say, which makes sense, we don't have to get into the debates of why, but let's just assume you're going to see a fairly raging climate for the next few decades of your career. And one of the things about that is you're going to have to deliver bad news. So one of the things that I talk about in the new book is having to tell people around the concept of managed retreat, which is that they won't be able to come back to the homes. And we're seeing communications in local government really struggling with how to deliver bad news. So they temper it a little bit, like, one of the things that we'll see with things like culvert collapses and sinkholes is I'm still hearing, in initial press statements, households and communities being told it'll be about a week, 2 weeks. It's years, and then maybe not at all. So one of the things that I really struggled with in the pandemic, and this was giving advice at the most senior level, the government level, was at first they were like, is this a 6-week pandemic? That well-known epidemiological phenomenon. And then will it be over? You'll remember Freedom Day, the misnomer of Freedom Day on July the 19th. And I remember there was this massive over-optimism about delivering good news, but also a hatred of delivering bad news. There are other more kind of very difficult good lies that I see. So, for example, very early on in my career, and you'll know from When the Dust Settles, I'm working as I still do now, with a lot of mortuary colleagues and funeral directors, and they were constantly challenging good lies like, the person was sleeping when they died, and that's often then later disproved at the inquest or whatever. So one of the things that I'm really wary about is the use of the kind of fluff or the buying of time. And I would say the biggest lies we tell at the moment are around how justice will be delivered and what a legal process is for. And this is, I noticed people posting in response to the latest COVID inquiry report, and it was clear that people thought that at some point the inquiry will recommend criminal charges, and that's not what an inquiry does. So this kind of misleading of what something does. Again, it comes back to that point with your colleagues of testing the lyricism. How do you say difficult things? And probably in the most recent 4 incidents, I've queried releases that were either way too optimistic or were going to lead to a loss of trust because they were filled with either hopium or, bluntly, for lovely reasons, mistruths.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like saying to a kid, did you clean the window? Yes, mum. Or did you eat that chocolate? There's chocolate all over the face. We've got to find ways to be honest. And we think we're honest, but I think the duty of candor is really going to throw out whether we really are.
Interesting. My wife, for a long time, was a nurse, and they introduced duty of candor while she was there, and it did change the practice. Tell me about hopium. Not just the great words, but like explain the concept to us.
I love it. Thank you. So it's exploring the role that are sort of opposite of it. One of the things, and I use a beautiful quote from Rebecca Solnit at the end of When the Dust Settles, and hope is written into so much of the disaster recovery literature. The idea, where else would we be without it? You've got to come back from these things. You've got to see across a horizon into a new life. So hope is really important. But one of the things that I'd written about Come What May, because Come What May is very much more about gentle, hopefully not too unsettling challenge, was I also see in responses a lot of hopium. And that is basically over optimism and sort of leading a little bit into denial. And of course, in our, one of the things I do with Come What May is bring this home into our own lives. So it's things like possibly knowing that a situation's getting worse with an ailing relative or with an older person we're caring for, and not looking at that situation, hoping constantly things will get better against the evidence base, really, which is a very human condition. But in disaster, sometimes it would mean, exactly what we just said before. People would do with it's a feature of older age, but a friend said to me recently, my house has got subsidence. We're having to move out. They've said it's between 5 and 12 weeks, so I'm working on 5 weeks. And I said, no, I want you to work on 15 weeks. Yeah. And we were at a party and everyone looked at me like, wow, you don't do that. Like I think in many societies, but certainly in British society, you don't kind of rain on anybody's parade. And she sort of looked, and it's a bit like, can I say this? And it's a very interesting dynamic. And I think particularly in things like friendship groups, hopium's very ripe, and it's and it's very dark as well. It's things like, well, he'll get better. He'll stop being a terrible partner, or that we will be able to pay the bills next month. Hopium is a very big part of the human condition. But what I'd realised, and Come What May is really a book about how emergency planners do things differently, was we don't do it. So we are pessimistic optimists, and we live with great joy and with great love and with great delight, definitely. But there is a necessary pessimism. So I've just done an interview. This is my second one, actually. I'm so pleased. I've just done an interview with Good Housekeeping. I mean, that was where I wanted to be. So the first one earlier this year was on 35 things to have at home to prepping and be ready for your survival. And then today was on if you're stuck in your car, emergencies. You can say, I'm just going to be their regular guest columnist.
Yeah, the poster girl, aren't you? There.
This is the dream. I'm waiting for the makeover request. But I think, one of the things with that was straight away, I'm like, okay, we're going to talk. And what you find with lovely, lovely interviewers is they'll come back and go, oh, that's a bit negative. I don't worry about that. And you have to dispense with the hope for us to be able to get to the place of talking about what you need in your car, because there's about 20 minutes with a lot of these discussions where people go, it might never happen, they might. Okay, but that's not, you've come to the wrong person for that discussion. We're getting straight into when your car is in flood water. And so one of the things about me when you train with me is I never use if. That was an early tip from a disaster colleague. I only talk about when, so I'll say when you have your incident. And you certainly see goal groups twitch at that, when you have your incident. And what I'm really pleased about, because there's some big assumptions in what I've just said. Does it help to think like this? I believe it does. I'm feeling very validated because later on in December, BBC Radio 4 have got a programme with me that we've put together called Are You Ready? Which is really hard to say without it sounding like a game show. And it's about the sort of history of how we lost our ability to think like this and prep a bit better. And the blurb has come up as like Lucy Easthope is on a mission to get us all better prepared. And do you know what? That just makes me feel good. And I think one of the things is like I want the nation to not be scared, but I do want them to be a bit more ready for the things that might come. And in order to do that, we need to dispense a bit with hopium. So I feel like Come What May's laid the ground for me then to be able to say, I need you to think about difficult things, because brutally the stats show we can save more people in a storm. We can get more people through. We can stop, one of the secondary ways people die in power cuts is if they have candles at home and they try and use candles. I don't want that. I don't want any, unlike a lot of people, I've seen what a fire does. And so I think one of the things for me is hopium is one of those things I have to challenge, but I've never lost hope. There's always hope.
I was listening to you then, I was thinking that there would be no Grand Designs episodes if there wasn't for this abundance of hopium. Kevin is the arch pessimist, isn't he? And then you've got all these people each week, living on hopium and not much else. But
yeah, and it's a funny one, isn't it? And how it affects your life and your dreams and because you can keep. One of the things that I say in Come What May is, hope and hopium, and I use this example, is so entangled with my own journey to have, my beautiful baby girls. There's so much just pure, like fanciful hope, and so hope's so important to me. And I think I craft that chapter so that you don't ever lose sight that hope's crucial to me as well.
We live in, as you said earlier, an age of 24-hour news, of TikToks and viral social media and so on. Do you think leaders are getting increasingly nervous or tongue-tied and feeling risky of saying that, that it's too risky to say the wrong thing and stepping back?
Yes, I do. I think, and one of the things that one of the dangers for sort of modern communications is I am seeing leaders paralyzed, and I'm seeing a lot of fear of getting it wrong. And I remember, fortunately, I did it in an exercise. I didn't do it for real, but I remember in an exercise with an airline, and I was talking about the return of personal effects, which is the items from the deceased. I talked about goods instead of items, or your loved one's belongings. And one of the things that I'm very aware of is that we scrutinize language such a lot that people can feel very paralyzed. So I just use the word loved ones, and in fact I was at an event last week that talked about how problematic the term loved ones is, and we use these sort of catch-all phrases sometimes. So one of the things that I'm finding is that I'm sat with colleagues perhaps about to go into incredibly difficult meetings, and they're very senior and they're very competent, but they're scared. And almost like we've and that's a real burden, I think, on comms professionals to not over remove the humanity. So you mustn't say this, you mustn't do that, please remember this was the line. And one guy actually said to me, who's sort of in the middle of a storm at the moment for a healthcare scandal, he said, I just wish we could talk normally, and I just wish we could talk to the families. And I remember Jimmy McGovern saying to me when we were working together in the early 2000s, the famous screenwriter, and he said, the insurance companies and the lawyers have got so in the way of all of this. And I think, a lot of the people you're advising are feeling paralyzed. They're not being able to say things. There's a very high stakes thing about not making any mistakes in, say, a briefing, or if you're chatting with families who've lost somebody, or you're in a community meeting. One of the big things that started to happen, and I'd seen it in the 60s and 70s, this wasn't necessarily new, but the idea of maintaining your face the whole time when you could be filmed. So, you trip over walking up the stairs into the press conference as the chief of police, and you smile with embarrassment, and that smile's the front page. There was the big thing that we used to say at disaster scenes, and particularly rail crash scenes, where the camera view would desperately try and get somebody would doing what they would look like wiping a tear. So it looked like a young police officer wiping a tear. And I remember being with the police officer the morning after that paper had done the front page, and she had something in her eye. She was at the scene getting it out of her eye. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing from people who have to speak on difficult things is that they are feeling very paralyzed, very observed. Everything is scrutinized, and one of the roles that I've ended up playing, and it's an interesting one, is probably, and I'm not catching and killing any story, but probably about 8 times a month, a journalist who trusts me will ring me up and go, "This has come in. Is it?" And you're like, "No, I don't know what the technical term is, but that's bollocks." And I think that we also have to protect the truth in all of this, even if that sometimes means, a story that would be a great takedown for an organization. And so I feel quite proud sometimes of going, no, that isn't. The most recent example was there was a contract put out, and it was for a mass fatalities program. How we support the country if there's a major incident, and it's a standard Home Office contract, but it had been picked up by the far right as an example that we were sort of planning for very dark times. And I was able to show that contract is something we've put out for 40 years. So I think one of the things is not feeling paralyzed about what we say, how to say sorry, how to mess up. There's such difficult things to do. And also more and more now, I think the UK is adopting things like a US approach, where, for example, you see a press conference with maybe 50 agencies crammed in, and it's all wild. Recently I saw what I thought was a senior policeman do a brilliant statement on the steps, and then he got torn apart in the media. It's a really brutal time to try and use your words.
Before we close, can I ask you to do a little bit of future gazing? And in your view, just from what you've seen and experienced, what should crisis comms training look like in 2026 and beyond? What things should we be cognizant of?
Okay, so there's some key words: brave, imaginative, dangerous. And also, when your communications professionals suggest something, remember they're suggesting something. It's not something they necessarily believe. Like, allow what we call in disaster thinking the wild card thinker. So if they bring in something that feels a bit, wow, that's really difficult to imagine, don't turn on them. So I give you an example. Well before the pandemic, there were concerns about people who would be fiercely opposed to vaccinations, particularly those developed from stem lines, and that there would be certain religious groups that would oppose vaccinations in the likelihood of a pandemic. And we tried to build that into exercises, and then people would sort of turn on us saying, "Are you anti-vax?" So allowing comms professionals to bring in wildcard thinking without them being sort of pilloried for being the thinker of it. And then I think the other thing would be, one thing I really think is interesting to test is what I call being thrown under the bus by other agencies. It's actually the hardest thing to respond to, is the other person's comms makes you look poor. And this is a really difficult thing. The more and more we do kind of collaborative working, interagency working. So obviously in the UK, we use a structure in public sector emergency management called the Local Resilience Forum. And we train for this lovely collective phase. But what happens when that goes wrong? I'm really interested, and I try and get to as many conferences as I can on AI. I try not to be sort of negative about it. I try and learn about it. Obviously, that's going to keep evolving. and deciding on where you are going to take people to find out about your message. And one of the things that's very difficult for people is that social media is still in flux. A lot of the comms professionals I talk to don't think that necessarily LinkedIn or Blue Sky are the future for this, but where else will we be posting, and what will that look like? And one thing we're telling everybody to train, which sounds so nostalgic, is the no tech emergency. So it's back to loud hailers, pen and paper, what we call the Luddite exercise, which very few people do. And do remember the most recent government guidance, which is that your plans, including your comms plans, should also be in paper form. So go back in time.
Excellent. Well, I mean, as someone who started his life in the newspaper office, bashing away at an old-fashioned typewriter, I think that's a perfect place to end today's conversation. Lucy Easthope, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much again.
Very, very, very happy to be here. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to PR in the Real World. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could subscribe to the podcast and leave us a quick review. Your support really helps spread the word and reach more marketing and PR professionals just like you. And don't forget to share this podcast with your colleagues or anyone who'd benefit from the insights we share. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more tips, strategies and real world stories from the PR frontlines.